Ifa Divination, the ancient system that survived the crossing, a thousand-year-old binary code, preserved in human memory, that UNESCO recognized as irreplaceable to humanity's intellectual heritage. Long before silicon chips encoded binary language into the architecture of modern computing, long before zeros and ones became the foundation of the digital age, the Babalawos of iLife were casting divination chains to produce patterns of single and double marks that encoded the accumulated wisdom of a civilization. The system they practiced, and practice still, goes by the name Ifa. It represents something unprecedented in the documentation of human knowledge systems, an oral tradition so vast, so internally consistent, so mathematically sophisticated that it survived slavery, survived cultural suppression, survived the destruction of kingdoms, and emerged intact on 3 continents with its core structure unaltered. When UNESCO proclaimed Ifa a masterpiece of the oral and intangible heritage of humanity in 2005, the organization acknowledged what practitioners had maintained for centuries. This was not folklore. This was not primitive belief. This was a functioning intellectual technology that had preserved knowledge across generations when no written word could be trusted to survive. The city of iLife sits in present-day Nigeria, sacred to the Yoruba people as the place where creation itself began, where the Orisha Obatala descended on a chain to form the first land from primordial water. Archaeological evidence at the site reveals continuous ritual practice extending back at least a millennium, with artifacts consistent with the divination methods still employed today. The earliest European documentation comes from Portuguese missionaries and traders in the 16th century, who observed with evident confusion that kings and commoners alike consulted specialists who cast palm nuts or chains, recited lengthy verses from memory, and prescribed specific actions based on the patterns that appeared. These specialists, the Babalawos, underwent training that could span decades. They memorized not dozens or hundreds, but thousands of verses, each associated with one of 256 possible configurations called odus. Each odu contained stories, prescriptions for ritual action, prohibitions, medical treatments, legal precedents, and spiritual protocols. The system addressed every situation human beings encounter: illness, conflict, romantic entanglement, financial crisis, legal trouble, spiritual attack, and the navigation of major life transitions. The mathematical structure underlying Ifa reveals its sophistication. The Babalawo casts 8 positions, each producing either a single mark or a double mark. This binary process generates 2 to the 8th power possibilities, exactly 256 odus. Each casting produces a specific configuration, and that configuration calls forth its associated corpus of verse. The Babalawo recites the relevant portions, often for hours, drawing on decades of memorized material. The client listens for the story or image that resonates with their situation. The prescription follows: specific sacrifices called Igbo, directed to specific orishas, accompanied by behavioral modifications, ritual baths, talismanic preparations, or more elaborate ceremonies. Follow-up divination tracks whether the prescribed work produces the desired shift. The system does not claim to predict a fixed future, but to reveal the spiritual forces currently shaping events and the ritual actions that can alter their trajectory. William Bascom, conducting fieldwork in Nigeria in the 1960s, documented the Ifa system with the rigor of a trained anthropologist and the fascination of someone encountering an intellectual achievement that defied his expectations. His 1969 work, Ifa Divination, Communication Between Gods and Men in West Africa, presented the system to Western academic audiences with careful attention to its internal logic. Bascom noted the mathematical correspondence between Ifa's 256 binary-generated odus and the 64 hexagrams of the Chinese I Ching, another ancient divination system built on binary principles. He was careful not to claim historical connection between these traditions developed on opposite sides of the world, But the parallel suggested something profound. That binary coding, as a method for organizing knowledge, emerged independently in multiple sophisticated civilizations, long before the modern computer age recognized it as the optimal structure for information processing. The Yoruba kingdoms of what is now Nigeria experienced catastrophic disruption in the 18th and 19th centuries. The collapse of the Oyo Empire, internal warfare, and the transatlantic trafficking in human lives, transporting hundreds of thousands of Yoruba people to the Americas. The peak period coincided with the early 1800s. These were not generic Africans stripped of cultural identity, as older historiography sometimes suggested. They were Yoruba people, often educated in their own traditions, sometimes Babalawos themselves, who carried in their memories what could not be written down or packed in ships' holds. They carried the verses. They carried the casting methods. They carried the names of the Orishas and the ritual protocols for maintaining relationship with them. In Cuba, where large Yoruba populations concentrated in urban areas, they established what became known as Regla do Ifa, a continuation of Nigerian Ifa adapted to Caribbean circumstances. In Brazil, particularly in Salvador, Bahia, where Yoruba people were called Nego, Ifa practice became central to the Candomblé tradition. The Portuguese physician and ethnographer Nina Rodrigues documented Ifa divination in Bahia in the 1890s. He recorded Babalawos reciting verses in Yoruba language, then compared them to texts he later obtained from Nigeria. The correspondence stunned him. The same verses, transmitted orally across the Atlantic, separated by decades and thousands of miles, remained functionally identical. This preservation defies what scholars thought possible for oral traditions. Writing was supposed to be necessary for knowledge transmission across generations and geography. The Ifa corpus, by conservative estimates, contains tens of thousands of verses. Some lineages claim hundreds of thousands. Yet generation after generation of Babalawos in Nigeria and in the diaspora memorized this material without written reference, maintaining its coherence through methods of apprenticeship, repetition, and ritual reinforcement. The human mind, when properly trained and culturally supported, proved capable of feats the literate world had declared impossible. The dangers Ifa addresses are not metaphorical. The tradition identifies what it calls ajagun, forces of adversity that actively work against human well-being. These include Iku, the force of death, Arun, illness, Ofo, loss, Yuhu, prohibition violation, and others. In Ifa theology, these entities possess agency and intention. They are held in check by the Orishas and by correct ritual practice. When ritual obligations are neglected or when spiritual attack is directed through specialized practitioners, the ajagun gain access. A case documented by anthropologist Roland Abiodun in Lagos in 1971 involved a factory owner whose business experienced 4 separate fires over 18 months. Conventional explanations failed. Electrical inspections found no faults. Security found no evidence of arson. Ifa divination identified spiritual attack sourced from a business rival who had engaged a specialist to perform aggressive ritual work. The prescribed countermeasures involved specific sacrifices to Ogun, the Orisha governing iron, technology, and protection, along with ritual isolation of the factory site using materials and methods specified in the relevant Odu. The fires stopped. The business rival perished in an unrelated accident the following year, which the Babalawo interpreted not as coincidence, but as spiritual consequence, the ajagun returning to their source when properly redirected. The precision of Ifa response distinguishes it from generalized spiritual advice. When a specific person casts divination for a specific crisis, the Odu that appears contains, according to tradition, exactly the information relevant to that situation. The Babalawo does not offer personal opinion, but recites the verses associated with the configuration. The client listens for resonance. The prescription follows from the Odu, not from the practitioner's judgment. This structure creates a system where the diviner functions as translator rather than authority, interpreting the pattern but subordinate to the corpus. Ethnomathematicians studying Ifa have documented this as evidence of formal logical structure within an oral tradition, a systematic method for matching situation to prescription through binary encoding. The system's documentation across Nigeria, Cuba, Brazil, Trinidad, and the United States shows remarkable consistency. The same 256 odors appear, the same casting methods operate, the same core stories recur, adapted to local circumstances but maintaining structural integrity across continents and centuries. UNESCO's 2005 recognition as masterpiece of the oral and intangible heritage of humanity triggered urgent preservation efforts. The generation of maximally trained babalawos, those who memorized the largest portions of the corpus, was aging. Younger practitioners, educated in written traditions, often learned abbreviated versions. The decision was made to transcribe what had never been written, to create archives of what had existed only in human memory. Projects in Nigeria, Cuba, and Brazil recorded thousands of hours of verse. Scholars working with these transcriptions report consistent surprise at what they find. The depth of philosophical reflection, the practical wisdom embedded in the stories, the internal consistency of the system across its vast scope exceeds what colonial-era dismissals of primitive superstition had prepared them to encounter. Here was evidence of an intellectual achievement that survived conditions designed to erase it. The paradox of Ifa's survival defines its legacy. Systems preserved in writing often fail when books are burned or libraries destroyed. Ifa, existing only in trained memory, proved more durable. The Babalawos carried the tradition through the Middle Passage when no book could be smuggled, maintained it through slavery when teaching African languages was prohibited, adapted it to new lands while preserving its essential structure. This demonstrates something profound about human cognitive capacity and cultural resilience. Knowledge encoded in memory, transmitted through apprenticeship, reinforced through practice, and embedded in living tradition can survive catastrophes that erase written records. Modern mathematical analysis of Ifa continues to reveal unexpected sophistication. The binary structure underlying the 256 odus corresponds to principles that Western mathematics formalized only in the modern period. The system's method for generating prescriptions functions as an algorithm, a structured process for converting input to output. Some researchers have noted structural similarities between Ifa's organization and database architecture, where binary keys access stored information. These are not metaphorical comparisons. The functional logic operates on similar principles, suggesting that Yoruba civilization developed information technology using human memory as hardware, oral transmission as software, and binary encoding as the underlying structure. The question that haunts researchers who study Ifa seriously is not whether it works according to its practitioners' understanding, because the testimonial evidence across centuries and continents confirms that it does for those who engage it properly. The question is how it works. The standard materialist explanation would attribute its effectiveness to psychological factors, clients hearing what they need to hear, confirmation bias, self-fulfilling prophecy. But this explanation struggles with cases like the Lagos fires, where the prescribed rituals corresponded with cessation of events that conventional methods could not control. Practitioners offer a different explanation, one that violates materialist assumptions but corresponds with their lived experience. The odus access information unavailable through ordinary perception, the orishas respond to properly performed ritual, and reality itself possesses a spiritual dimension that Ifa navigates with systematic precision. The survival of Ifa represents a victory against enormous odds. Colonial suppression, religious conversion campaigns, the catastrophe of enslavement, the pressure of modernity all work to erase African spiritual traditions. Most did not survive intact. Ifa did, not through accommodation or dilution, but through the stubborn insistence of generations of practitioners that this knowledge was too important to lose, that it contained wisdom necessary for human navigation of an uncertain world. The fact that researchers now study it with respect, that UNESCO recognizes it as heritage essential to humanity, that scholars find in its structure unexpected sophistication, these vindicate what the Babalawos always maintained. This was never superstition. This was technology. This was science. This was philosophy. This was medicine. This was a complete intellectual system encoded in oral form and preserved through human dedication when every other method of preservation failed. If you found this case compelling, subscribe to Vanishing Roads for more documented paranormal investigations from around the world. This story was created with AI assistance based on documented case files. All events reference real investigations and reported incidents.